Hello, welcome to the 12th episode of Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Marc.
And I'm Chad Lott.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the 1979 film Phantasm. And a quick heads up, next episode, we're going to be talking about Pontypool from 2008, a Canadian horror film. I think it's fantastic. It's a little bit obscure. It is on Netflix. It's pretty easy to find, but I really recommend everybody see it. It's actually one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, it was on a lot of people's lists of like unexpected great horror movies, and it has a really fun cast, really small cast, which is something I always really like in movies. They're like tight, dialogue driven movies.
Yeah.
And an interesting take on maybe zombies.
Maybe zombies. Yeah, exactly. And then after that, we are going to be covering the 2015 film Green Room.
And we're going to have a guest for that episode, Eugene Robinson, who currently he's the editor over at OZY, which is kind of like a Vice competitor, I guess. Vice magazine competitor.
That's kind of fair. Maybe a little less hipsterish.
Modern Vice, like what they're trying to be, kind of like. So more news focused. And then he wrote a really great book that I really liked called Fight, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Ass Kicking, but were afraid you'd get your ass kicked for asking. It's just like a really good kind of like post-Fight Club, early days jiu-jitsu book. And it was just a fun book and really probably kept me from getting my ass beat several times just because I took the wisdom in that book pretty seriously. And
he'll be perfect for the movie Green Room. He's also the singer in the band Oxbow.
And he has a play out too, but I'm not familiar with the play.
We can ask him about it when he gets here. Yeah, that's 2 episodes away, but just want to prime you all. See Pontypool and see Green Room.
Yeah, Green Room, not straight horror, more of a thriller.
Yeah.
But, it's kind of blurring that line. There's no supernatural element.
Yeah. So. And it's punk as fuck. What more can you ask?
Yeah.
Let's get this out of the way. We're assuming that you've seen Phantasm, so we're not going to announce any spoilers. This is all spoilers, and we're not reviewing the movie. This is us talking about something you and I and Chad have all seen. And
if you're feeling pretty generous with your time, go over to iTunes and give us a rating and a review. We're told it helps us out in our eternal war against the machines. And you can also go over to @scarythoughts.podcast on Instagram and keep up on kind of our latest news and funny imagery that our intern puts up there. A lot of inspirational messaging, although we're branching out to new stuff lately. And most of our conversation with our listeners tends to happen over at our Facebook page, which is @scarythoughts. However Facebook does it. But that's a good spot. And we're posting a little bit more content on that site, just interesting things we find that we like, that we think you might like, that's horror related.
And we also just started an email newsletter. So if you go to scarythoughts.org, you can sign up. There's a little sign up boxes there and stay in the loop.
Yeah.
And then we have a quick plug. You were on the podcast
Popcorn, Piss, and Vinegar, which is my favorite movie podcast, because it's a bunch of guys I know from Louisiana. So if you ever want to get your like Southern Louisiana culture on, those guys are awesome. It's an episode about Poltergeist. Who knows how long it'll be back in their catalog when this episode comes out. They're pretty frequent recorders. They usually have an episode about once a week, which is pretty good. Good for any of your genre film news. And they describe it as like being in a locker room, and I completely agree.
Right on. So where do we start with Phantasm?
Well, the tagline is, if you're not afraid, you're already dead. So I realized that I must be dead because I'm not afraid. There's something really interesting about those taglines for these horror movies, because it's like some copywriter has tried to create what they think this movie is about. And I think that's an interesting place to start, because like, what the hell is this movie about? I mean, with that, if you're not afraid or you're already dead, it's kind of one of those like conditional syllogisms that's really popular in marketing, where it's like, if you're not that, then this. But what would you say? What would you say about this movie if you were going to write a line of copy for the poster?
I don't know. I honestly think that like Phantasm had a great poster and a great tagline. Mm-hmm. Like, in combination, spoke very highly of this movie. Yeah. I don't know if you can top "If this doesn't scare you, you're already dead." I think that's about as good a horror tagline. And it's vague. Mm-hmm. It's not direct. And it's not quite like "In space, no one can hear you scream," which just thinking about that is...
That's my favorite one. That's
just terrifying. Like,
that's the best one of all time.
That's just existentially upsetting to think about.
Yeah. So if I were to describe this movie, I would call it a sci-fi midget zombie movie.
Oh, that. I mean, it's definitely sci-fi, but it's pretty soft sci-fi, you know? There's no spaceships and laser guns and all that. I mean, it's almost sci-fi the way the Rocky Horror Picture Show is sci-fi.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, because the ending of this movie...
The house glows.
The house glows. And, okay, so the house, we're really getting ahead of ourselves, but there's a mausoleum that is actually the Dunsmuir House, which is in Oakland, California. We can go visit it, go on a field trip if we wanted to.
We should.
It's also in So I Married an Axe Murderer.
Can we rent dirt bikes and go tear around the grounds?
Well, that's the thing. I don't understand. Who runs a two-stroke motorcycle through a graveyard? I mean, I have a picture of myself on a motorcycle in a graveyard.
Well, maybe if you lost your parents and...
Well, I mean, look, if you're like the ultra latchkey kid like this dude, then I guess you can do whatever you want. There's no stopping Mike from tearing around these grounds. But at the end of this, a large house, a castle of sorts, disappears into another dimension, another world, using the Star Trek transporter effect, which is pretty awesome. I mean, it's literally the effects from Star Trek that they just borrowed and used to make the house disappear. But it has that similarity to the end of Rocky Horror Picture Show, where the house floats up and disappears. You know, at one point I'm like, oh, is Mike gonna just wake up with Reggie's bleeding body singing Superheroes at the end of this? But yet the sci-fi elements of this movie are really almost more per like Don Coscarelli. Is that how you say his name? Don Coscarelli? He was really influenced by horror movies that had science fiction explanations. That's kind of what he talks about. So his idea was that like these horrific, mutated, crazy things happen, but they're not because of ghosts and the supernatural. They're because of unknowable science fiction elements, which is very H.P. Lovecraft.
Sure. One thing I did really appreciate is that because he took that route with this film, especially in an era of slasher films, really, what happens is, you know, you get the first death, which is the tall man as the lady in lavender knifing Tommy.
Yep.
While they're fake having sex in the graveyard. I wanted to get into sex in this movie later. But the next is that the fortune teller's daughter gets killed in the mausoleum. I don't know what she was doing there, but she just goes, and disappears. Yeah. And then the third death is when the sentinel attaches itself to the Undertaker's forehead and shoots blood out. And so you've got three deaths. They're totally disconnected. And so in most horror films, generally speaking, you see a bunch of deaths and they're generally very connected. And you often don't know what's happening. Like, you don't know what's up with Michael Myers or Jason or Freddy. But there's a consistency that you're following down a linear path. Whereas in this film, you just genuinely have no idea what's going on. Each death is completely different. And then the explanation is very peculiar, which is really refreshing for a horror film.
Yeah, that initial death starts off with the typical, like, you're having sex, now you have to die. So it really sets you up to sort of expect a straightforward story, and it's anything but. I mean, I think when I rewatched this movie, the first time I rewatched it, I was a little bit put off by how not great the acting is and how really sort of hokey some of the scenes are. Like the coffin that the tall man picks up, you can see is clearly busted. You can see a rope on the side of it where he's picking it up to make it kind of more handy for him as an actor to pick up this papier-mâché coffin. And then I started thinking about like how original a lot of these ideas are, and the movie, it went from being kind of a hokey sort of horror movie in my mind at that moment to being like, oh, this is kind of like a punk rock album. It's like there's good ideas, there's good energy, there's good thought, there's just maybe somebody doesn't know how to play their instrument quite that well, but it's still a classic album.
That's exactly how I thought about it. I thought about it more of like a punk band's first amazing record, where there's just so much energy, and that energy communicates past the abilities.
Yep.
And so Don Coscarelli, he didn't go to film school, but this was his third feature, and he was like 24 when he made it. He was very, very young. And so there are a lot of obvious limitations. However, I don't want to get too negative on it right at the beginning of the episode because I think there's a lot to praise in this film.
Yeah.
But if you watch his further films, all the rest of the Phantasm films, or excluding the final one, which he did not direct, all of the problems that Phantasm has,
not solved by money.
They're not solved by money or time.
Yeah.
9 years to write a script and it's still not a better script.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things you could really look at this movie and be like, okay, a lot of what's hokey about it seems to have been a finance problem. So the dude had like $300,000 to make this movie, and it said that he was not able to always have all the actors on hand. Like, he just could not get them there at the same time. So the shooting schedule was based on when someone would call him up and be like, yeah, I have like 3 days coming up. Can you shoot? And so they would shoot around these other people's schedules and be adapting the script the whole time to kind of fit these things. And so the original cut of this movie is like something like 3 hours long and had all these subplots and all these explanations. So when you see things going nowhere in this film, you get the feeling that they're like the glimpses of these things that should have happened or should have been played out. And the special effects are largely bad. I mean, I think the spear sentinels, those effects actually work really well and are surprisingly low tech. Like when they had the ball flying through the air, they literally just had somebody chuck it really hard down the hallway.
Backward. And reverse the film.
Reverse film it. And
Great.
It works, and those are the little elements of this film that are just super punk rock to me. Like, like you do your first 4-song EP and you don't know what to do, so you just hang a microphone from the middle of the room and just record.
Yeah.
That sort of stuff is pretty cool. Also, it's funny, like the spheres appear in this video game called Turok 2, but they're called cerebral bores, which I thought would be like another good name for like continental philosophy. Just cerebral because it's cerebrally boring, at least to me anyway.
Nice. Well, one thing I would love to talk about on the positive side of this movie is I think aesthetically it's just amazing. And, we've been talking a lot about horror that's influenced by Kubrick. And, I've been talking a lot about it in terms of like aesthetic horror. And I think this movie actually really nails that sort of aesthetic because this film isn't that scary, I don't think. But it's really uncanny. It's really weird. And I think most of what's weird about it, aside from the alienarity of so much of the screenplay, is the mausoleum and the symmetry and the hard asymmetry and all these hard lines and the sort of Italian synth soundtrack, sort of John Carpenter soundtrack.
Yeah, kind of goblin-y.
Kind of goblin-y.
Yeah.
And I think that...
Meaning Goblin, the band that did Suspiria, not some sort of weird, like, David Bowie Labyrinth thing.
Also scary. And, the movie starts off really slow and atmospheric. A lot of long takes, a lot of, like, pans, and you don't know what's going on. And it really sets it up.
Yeah.
Where you're sinking into this world. And I think that is... for me, actually, the best part of this movie, aside from some really interesting deaths and the tall man, which we should talk about later, is these really, really well art directed shots that goddamn, for $300,000, pretty damn solid.
There's just a lot of really good cinematography. I mean, basically any of the scenes where it's like a dream sequence and this camera's very still and it's a very staged imagery, like the really famous image of Mike lying in the bed with the tall man over him and the zombies kind of come out of the ground. That's just classical almost. It almost has like the look of like a Robert Mapplethorpe photograph. It's so dark in places and the light pops out so interestingly, and then there's a macabre element to it, of course, because it's a horror movie. But I thought that stuff was really cool. And then there's some shots are just better than they have any right to be. Like when they pull the dwarf that is Tommy out of the hearse after it crashes, like kind of like late in the movie, there's a shot where he's like looking down and he's like puking out the yellow material, which in the 80s I read in Fangoria or something that stuff is supposed to be embalming fluid, but I was never able to find anything about that online looking at. But so I'm just going to go with it. It's embalming fluid. But the way it's tilted, it almost looks like that really famous picture of the head of John the Baptist, that painting. It just had like, there were so many shots in this movie that had like almost like Renaissance painting feel to it, which is being way over generous, but still, it is sort of striking that such a cheap movie would look so good.
Yeah, certainly. Something else that I really appreciate about this, and this, keep talking about bands, that this is almost an ensemble cast. I mean, even before this became a franchise, Don, the director, had already worked with most of this cast in his last two movies, which just for the record, I'm going to say this. I watched all of the Phantasm movies. I mean, a lot of people have seen them all. So that's not like some big triumph of mine, but it felt like a triumph when I sat through those fucking things. And I also watched Kenny and Company, the film that just preceded this, which is this. It was a little bit like my childhood, honestly. It was like 70s, BMXs riding around the suburbs, getting away with weird shit because there were no rules back then.
Yeah.
But this is an ensemble cast, and these are all friends. And in the future franchise episodes of Phantasm, there were opportunities to totally sell out, and they didn't. I mean, they might have lost some opportunities too, which it's easy to say we didn't sell out when you actually blew it. But to their credit, they were all in. Most of them were all in all of the movies. He directed and wrote all of these movies. They did, they did the music.
Yeah.
Coscarelli, it was his family who did like art direction and starred in it and financed it and got distribution. So that punk rock ethos, that DIY ethos, weaves through not just this movie where it's this like young filmmaker trying to make his way through Hollywood, but actually like an ethos that carried through his whole career.
Yeah, there's something about these kind of like small level, auteur in their own way filmmakers that they have their gang. You see it with Kevin Smith has a gang of dudes he always uses, and Sam Raimi does as well. And
or the Christopher Guest movies. I mean, a little different, but it's a similar thing.
And what's his name? Royal Tenenbaums director Wes Anderson.
Yep.
Anderson. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So he also has that, and there's something like familiar about it that's fun, like you're seeing your old friends again or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in his film Kenny and Company, there's a haunted house scene that is said to have kind of pushed him down the road of interest in a horror movie. Do you think that was a significant scene, or what's it even like? I haven't seen it.
It's not. I mean, there's a haunted house scene. I mean, there's nothing significant about Kenny and Company. It's really just a slice of life film. Even being generous about it, it's just a slice of life film, and the haunted house scene is pretty small. I think it was just Don Coscarelli was in the audience watching a screening, and everybody jumped when, this big creepy hand grabbed a kid and was like, oh, I like the effect that had on an audience, and he wanted to take that further. But it wasn't it didn't feel like a seed of Phantasm in that movie by any means.
It's interesting, like, you remember the director of It Follows had done kind of a slice of life movie right before It Follows came out that had nothing particularly creepy, but there were elements, and you wonder, like, it's interesting that somebody would have thought, aha, horror, that's the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But the director, he is a sci-fi and horror fan. Like that's like one of the things about him is he has a real deep love for the genre. And I was watching some interview with him, and I was really happy to hear him say that the movie that they wanted to make was Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is the Ray Bradbury movie, which had just been optioned by Disney or something like that, and they weren't able to make it. But when I watched this movie, and especially the second one, there's definitely an element of that Something Wicked This Way Comes, like a man comes into town and has these weird powers and sort of tricks the townspeople into going off and into his weird, like, damnation game.
Yeah. Well, that actually brings up something, we often talk about collective dread. How do these horror movies that we watch insert themselves or reflect from the culture at large, and our, what are we afraid of? And do you feel like this film actually does that?
Well, the dread that the director and most of the commentators on the film at the time it came out all talk about it being about death and being the fear of death, and especially like the fear of the death industry a little bit. So there's a lot of anxiety about, like, what's someone going to do to your body once you're not in it anymore. And so in this case, is you get turned into a squashed down zombie that's going to have to go work the oil fields of some distant universe or something weird like that. And so I think that there is, a lot of the really creepy scenes in this movie are they're all in what for a lot of people is a very scary place, which is a mausoleum or a funeral home. That like one of the most tense scenes is when Mike has hidden himself away in a coffin and he's watching this caretaker walk slowly towards him. And then the camera shot is another really low key thing. It's like they use 2 pieces of cardboard to give him like the coffin slit view. And I think the whole idea of being in a coffin and having somebody come to you is very scary. But I think that with like the embalming shows and forensic file shows and even 6 Feet Under on HBO, a lot of that fear of the funeral home is maybe been dispersed a little bit.
Right. I think I was thinking about it a little differently, and the reason why I brought it up is thinking about Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is totally one of my favorite books. That it's almost like a subgenre of horror about the kid who sees something and no one will believe him. I don't think there's any with a girl. So,
Cassandra, right?
From
classic from Greek mythology.
Oh, Jesus!
Yeah,
no, not Jesus. It makes me think of that. Maybe we all identify with this idea that in our own subjectivity, we all sort of believe that we see the world as it really is. We all believe that we have this little window into the real world, and nobody quite gets it the way we do. And these films that use this narrative device are a sort of exploitation of that self-belief, right?
Yeah. There's also, to me, this movie, when it came out, I really related to it because I was kind of a latchkey kid like Mike is a little bit. And, even though his brother's there and Reggie's there and presumably right before the movie starts, Tommy was there, they're not his friends. That's his brother and his brother's friends. So Mike is very alone through a lot of this stuff. And when you look at his room and kind of he has that Zelansky novel, that sci-fi novel right there on his desk. And his room has like a big NASA poster and his interest in mechanics, and he's kind of like a MacGyver-y character. Like, I really related to the loneliness of that character, and the whole time he's just afraid of being left alone. Like, the parents have died, but at the time, I mean, it could almost be an anxiety metaphor for 2 parents in the workplace leaving you. So he's just left with nothing except for his imagination and time, and he goes and observes with binoculars just these weird occurrences, and then there are things he doesn't understand. So I think it would be easy not to believe him. You're like, okay, you're just this weird kid who has an active imagination. But I really love how he eventually does prove his case with the finger in the box. I like that in this movie, they eventually do believe him, which I think is kind of a neat feature of this, because a lot of times people don't believe what's going on until they get a knife in their face in these horror movies.
Right. Yeah, totally. What do you think of, jumping to the end, but what do you think of the "and then I woke up" nature of the screenplay?
Well, I feel like, okay, so he definitely wakes up, has that weird moment with Reggie where Reggie's like, I'll take the place of your brother, and then they have that picture of his brother, which is just so great. He's just posed with like a Maltese and his guitar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so weird. Just all these choices that are just odd. You just wonder if like that was just a photograph that actor just had.
It may well be.
That's probably how it was.
Yeah.
But it's one of the things that people talk about this movie about a lot is that there's was it real, was it not real? But then if you're looking at the text of the film, he gets dragged through a mirror by the tall man zombie, by the Jawas. They just straight Utini his ass. They're like, Utini! Like, just drag him through.
Wait, what's Utini? What?
It's the noise that the Jawas make. They go, Utini! Like, right before they just jack R2-D2. But I guess now would be a good time to mention that these characters were actually, it's just an independent idea. A lot of people say, they're Jawa ripoffs, because they really do look a lot like Jawas.
Yeah.
I think the entire extra dimensional with the hooded characters looks like Joy Division's Atmosphere video.
Oh, dude.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I don't know why I didn't think of that. It really is. It really is.
Yeah, I don't know when that video would have come out, but maybe close to the same time.
Yeah.
So it's neat. It's interesting. I think the oddness of the film maybe weights it a little more than most people, because there's other movies where it was a dream. It's not like this was the first time, but this might have been the first time where it's like, oh, was it a dream? No, psych, it's not a dream.
Right.
And then in the sequel, it's like, oh, maybe it is a dream, but psych, it's not a dream again.
Right.
It's always playing with this dreaminess. And this is one of the things, I read a review that somebody compared this film to like Jodorowsky's films, like playing with like that sort of like blurry dreamlikeness. And I don't know. I wonder how much of the disjointed dreaminess is just things just got cut out.
Right. So that's actually something that is most significant to me in my thinking about Phantasm is, so low budget filmmaking, you have to be very inventive with a lot of things. And then because film is so dependent on money, you just have to do creative solutions, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And they generally contribute to a very odd product.
Right.
And I think that, generally speaking, that works best in horror movies, because horror movies, you're already in the terrain of the uncanny and the weird. So a low budget, rom-com that has clunky dialogue and stuff like that, it just feels, it would really lose you in a way that doesn't happen with horror films, partly because of genre audiences' forgiveness. Yeah. And, a horror film audience is very different than a rom-com audience.
Right.
But if you're already in the realm of the surreal and the odd, and there's murder and mystery, then characters not really lining up and unresolved issues and things like that, it contributes to the atmosphere, actually, by accident. And so, in previous episodes, I've kind of talked about like the idea of making excuses for things. And I think that it's hard to know where in Phantasm is like, oh, it was this amazing concept versus like, it just kind of turned out weird that way. And thank God, because it makes it into a very unique film.
This movie made me think a lot about horror fans, because this movie is beloved by horror fans and people recommend it to other people. And I was going to watch it with my wife, and I was immediately thinking she's totally not going to like this at all, because it's just too stupid for her. And I mean, like the acting, I think, would be a hurdle to her. And so I started thinking about horror fans, and if you were to release this right now and it had been done like that on purpose, like somebody was making like a retro horror movie and they were going to keep all the stuff in it, like a purposely bad acting, purposely bad puppet creatures, stuff like that, like, would it play? And, there's only like certain scenes that are super difficult regarding that, and it's a lot of the dialogue, especially the scene where they right after they've killed the fly creature, and basically anything involving the finger fly creature, which I'm sure we could talk about in a second. Like that whole sequence, it's the one that Don Coscarelli said he was sort of the most disappointed in. It just kind of didn't play the way he hoped it would. But with horror film fans, I gotta think that a lot of them are readers. A lot of them probably played D&D or all this stuff where you have this idea of like a shared narrative. So you're doing a lot of work in your own brain to bring this stuff to life. And I think a horror fan is particularly well situated to have an overactive imagination to really think about this stuff. I'm always surprised when I'm reading reviews of horror or like a lot of the kind of like the fanboy videos and stuff like that. People talk about being so scared or so creeped out. And I never feel like that at all. But so many people really respond to these films in a scared way. And I think that has to do with the strong imagination of the horror fan.
Yeah, I think that something else that intersects with this is less the explosion of American horror films over the last 25 years, but, I'm very interested in especially European horror movies of the late 60s and early 70s. And most of those films are like 95% terrible, but there's like 3 deaths and 1 chase scene that are like bafflingly genius. And if they're Italian, you know, the sound is never fucking Italian movies and their shit sound. I can never get, even Fellini, I can't get past it. So you're watching this movie where like nobody's voices are coming out of their faces, but then there's just some weird scene with an eyeball popping out of someone's head and you can't get it out of your head, and it's kind of genius. And Phantasm, I feel like, is on that continuum. There's a lot of really terrible dialogue, a lot of really janky effects, but then, you know, the tall man says, boy, and you will never forget that shit. Yeah. Right?
There's really only one cerebral board spear death in this film. And it's really pretty, like, kind of a brutal death, you know, because the ball going into the forehead is a pretty cheesy effect. But when the body hits the ground and, like, it just pisses everywhere.
Yes.
Like, that's a really creepy sort of death thing that you don't even see in modern horror at all. True. You know, you're like, oh, that's like that's what happens when somebody dies, you know? And I thought that little detail was really good and made that scene a lot scarier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of the dialogue and the characters, I want to talk about that a little further. Something that I think is more significant than maybe the acting is, I don't know that the acting is necessarily that bad. I think the acting is generally fine. What I think it is the editing. Okay, in film editing, you don't want to cut to the person when they talk, when, like, I say something now, then we cut to you. And then you say something, and then you cut to me.
There's a lot of drag.
There's a lot of drag. There are, like, these long gaps, and it becomes monotonous if you're always cutting to the person right before they talk, and then as soon as they talk, you cut away. And it feels really stilted and really bad. The other thing is that it's hard to blame actors when they're given a script that's this terrible, because it's another one of those things that it was a problem in Phantasm, and then each further episode in the franchise, it becomes more and more apparent that this is an issue for this screenwriter. But nobody says something that they aren't thinking. Everybody thinks out loud, talks to themselves. I mean, I really found myself asking, is that what a real person would do or say in this circumstance? And the answer is almost always no.
Right.
That person would not do that. That person would not say that. That person is just saying the most obvious circumstantial thing they can to get through this scene. And again, low budget film, not much time, but then all those years later, it's just as bad. It's actually the writer.
Yeah, I mean, there's like Jody in particular, the character Jody, the older brother, has a lot of just really, I don't know if they're intentionally funny lines or what, but like the actor is not funny. Like, he doesn't seem to possess any comic timing. I was thinking about these lines, if they were delivered by Danny McBride, would just fucking kill. Like when he's like, "Are you sure it's not a gopher in heat?"
Right.
Like, that line is hilarious. It's just it just sort of delivered matter of factly. And then there's another one where Jody's still trying to deny what's happening. He's like, "Are you sure it's not the retarded kid up the street, Timmy?" And as a side, I wonder if that's where South Park got Timmy. Like, Timmy.
Oh, maybe.
Like, who knows? You know, I know those guys are genre fans too.
Another line that I think was the last straw for me with this is when they're kind of sitting around in front of the fire plotting. They're like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And Reggie's like, I know, we'll stomp that fucker and make him tell us what's going on. Like, what? Yeah. This is your plot. Like, you're going to go get the bad guy. That's the genius. Like, holy shit. Who wrote that line? Like, and you can't blame Reggie for his delivery. It's a terrible piece of dialogue. Yeah.
The scene where Jody's like giving Mike a shotgun and he's like, you know, no warning shots. Warning shots are bullshit. Like, it's just so hilarious. Like, these just lines. It's like this weird. And there's always these things that they say that don't happen. Like, you know, he's like, "Oh, he's a tough little kid. I'm going to miss him." Then why are you going to leave him with Anne? Yep. Like, if you're missing, I mean, I guess you might have a band or something like that. Like, I think that Tommy, Reggie, and Jody are in a band.
It's sort of implied.
It's sort of implied, right? Because they will say, like, "Oh, what a way to bust up a trio," you know. And then Tommy just looks like a drummer, you know. But then I like to also imagine that the band is called Hot as Love because,
Of course it is.
That's what he says. He says, or Reggie says, oh, it's, hot as love.
Yeah. No, it's funny that when looking at these old films and the way in which they're unresolved stylistically, you brought up McBride, but to me, so much of the acting and editing and dialogue reminds me of a Tim and Eric sketch or things that they would do independently.
Yeah. What's that Tim and Eric skit they have where it's just like the opening scene? It's like the opening scene of like Full House, but over and over and over again, and it just gets darker and darker and darker and darker.
Too Many Cooks.
Too Many Cooks, yeah. Like there are moments of Phantasm, or I'd rather, like I said, there are moments of Too Many Cooks that feel like a Phantasm era horror movie because there's a cheesiness, but there's also, it's progressively going off the rails, but you can't beat the cheesiness. And that's kind of Phantasm in a nutshell. It keeps going off the rails in weird directions, but it's like humbled by its own low budget.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the ideas of this film are very original. I mean, the whole idea of an interdimensional trade in shrunken down zombie slaves is a pretty weird idea. Like, I can't think of any source material for that. I mean, other than just, capitalism, I guess. And one of the things about the tall man is I think of him as, in the films, especially the sequels, he's walked out as this sort of like godlike demonic alien creature. But when you think about what he is, he's manufacturing probably a product for some sort of like way more powerful entity or organization in this other world. I mean, he kind of he's basically a shipping and receiving clerk. He's just putting him through his weird tuning fork portal into another dimension. And the whole look of that is just so interesting, and the really heavy-handed foreshadowing with the tuning fork in the beginning of the movie where Reggie just figures it out. And then Reggie like basically lays out the entire, just from some sort of like stoner deep space, pulls down this whole plot. Like he figures it out. It's like, hey man, they're small because of the gravity. And you're like, man, that's a stretch, but it's also literally what's happening. And then the tall man himself, the look of the tall man is so interesting, with his kind of like too small suit and shaggy hair and skinny tie. He's like an aging mod villain, kind of, just like you almost want him. I'm like, oh, is he going to play like a jam record in between?
No, I think the tall man is super great. Although the tall man in Phantasm is sort of one of my favorite villains. The tall man, as he rolls out into the future films, is one of my least favorite villains. And I think it comes down to world building again. And I know we suggested our listeners see Phantasm, and I'm sort of maybe spoiling the other films and talking past the film. But I think the greater point here is that in the future films, his powers just seem to be like infinite, and it really comes to bad writing and bad planning and the Freddy Krueger problem, which is that, see, in Phantasm, at the very end, we don't know what the tall man's powers are. Like, he keeps popping up and regenerating, and we don't actually know what he's up to, and I think that's super fascinating. But as the films develop, it's sort of that thing of like, oh, he can do that too? Oh, he can do that too? Okay, he's omnipotent. And so it really makes me think about this issue with horror films. And that issue is villainous trifling, where you have these villains who are omnipotent, but are toying with the victims or are easily defeated because they're not using their omnipotence very effectively. It's sort of bad writing. Yeah,
I mean, there's like a Tom and Jerry quality to it, especially in this film. Like, the tall man even says, you play a good game, boy. Yeah. And you really think about it, like if your whole job is squashing down corpses, putting them in barrels and putting them out into some external universe, you probably get pretty bored. And and how often does a zany kid with binoculars like discover what you're up to?
Yeah.
It might be just a bit of sport for the tall man.
So like the Jawas are like Oompa Loompas, and he's Willy Wonka, and he's just amusing himself by killing the kids.
Yeah. What did you think about the fortune teller scene? Like another scene that just seems to like not connect up to the rest of the film in any meaningful way.
I don't know. I actually really liked it in the same way that I like them sitting on the porch and playing music and talk and jive turkey 70s hipster language.
Yeah.
It gave the script and the character a little bit of depth that actually kind of gave you an insight into his character. Because I think, again, so much of a problem with this film is that the characters as they're created are interesting. Like this kid, he lost his parents and his older brother is going to move away because he's a musician and you know, so he's really clingy and like that's interesting. But the way it all rolls out is really, really flat. But when you see like the buddies playing on the doorstep and just playing music and hanging out, you feel that bond.
Right.
When you see Mike going to the fortune teller, you're actually seeing him trying to get some answers and him being up against himself. I mean, the scene is a little heavy-handed with the whole, like, don't fight it, Michael. And then there's the flashback to that scene later in the movie for no reason. I mean, it's really forced in there.
Yeah. I found that whole scene with the fortune teller to be kind of familiar because he's like something like my family would have done. Like instead of going to therapy, you go to a fortune teller. It's like, I mean, that's like what my grandmother would do, you know, and he is using the fortune teller as a bit of like a psychologist sort of. Like he goes in, tells her his problems. There's an exchange of money. She tells him, you know, don't fear, and that's lifted right out of Dune. You know, like the fortune teller is basically a Bene Gesserit, you know, where she's like, oh, here's a box, put your hand in the box. It's painful. It's only painful because you're afraid of it. And then, you know, the box appearing out of nowhere in front of him, he's just so matter of fact about, but then is later so freaked out by these other supernatural elements.
No, it's true. As far as the world that this movie exists in, the tall man is responsible for all these supernatural goings-on. But then what about that fortune teller being able to manifest this box?
Right.
That's a completely other level, a different level of surreality. And it's a bit, that for me is a bit of the Yara Z reader, the sort of like, one of these things doesn't belong. I mean, there's a lot of that in this movie, but that in particular is a bit like, okay, so there's real psychics who can make shit appear. I
mean, this is the thing about the world building is like her assistant, the young girl that's talking for her, goes to the mausoleum and disappears or something like that. And there's really no reason to. I mean, what if that lady's from that world?
Yeah.
You know, like she's also like an alien from that planet or something like that.
Totally. It's a stretch.
Yeah.
But speaking about the Yara Z reader issues in this movie, my biggest one that I mentioned at the outset was like, there are 2 sex scenes in this movie. Did anybody who works on this movie ever have sex in their life? It's so joyless. It functionally, like, that's not how 2 bodies collide. Like, it was really baffling to me.
And there's some real oddness to it too, in that like the breasts that you see are not the actresses; they're like stunt breasts.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about like she doesn't have any lines. She's not a great actress. Why didn't you just get the actress with the nice rack to be the actress? You know, and then you could have at least had like a little pull away shot or something like that. And then Mike has a stunt butt too. Like so, like none of the nudity.
But it was a stunt butt while he was lying on top of the actual actress, not the stunt breast woman.
It's so
but I think it was all that funk, you know, speaking earlier about like they just had to work with what they had. I do think the lady in lavender's interesting looking. I think she had an interesting allure on screen. Yeah.
And you know, these actresses probably had to have some pretty hard lines drawn in their own personal lives because like if you're doing horror in the late 70s, you're just like probably a paycheck away from pornography. You know, you're already in LA, you're already there. I mean, who knows?
I don't know. I didn't see very much written about why the sex in this film is so uncomfortable. You know, I mean, it's for the first scene is Tommy's on his back and he's just not moving. And he just goes, just suddenly, that was great, baby. Like, what?
Yeah,
That was him coming.
Yeah, and he's so low key about it, and like just such a mutant looking human too, just a weirdo. I mean, really everybody in this movie is kind of weird looking, and that's one of the things that's so great about it. And one of the things I think that really hurts remakes is everybody in Hollywood's hot now. Like nobody has weird teeth, nobody has like a nose that's unfortunate, or and definitely nobody has like the full on skullet. Like that's not a thing at all.
Yeah.
I mean, like I don't think there's probably a human alive that has that haircut like Reggie does. Maybe Reggie does still. I think he still has it.
The bass player for the band The Reflex in 1983 had that.
Oh, hair. The singer from Nashville Pussy too. He's rocking it pretty hardcore. But still, like you have these odd people, and I think that this like unusual look of these actors really helps the uncanniness of this film. And I don't know, was that carried through in the sequels? And you still have Reggie, but in the second one you don't have Mike anymore. You have false Mike,
fake Mike.
Yeah, they replace the actor.
But he comes back in 3, 4, and 5.
Super weird.
Yeah, dude. So like God, these movies just go so off the rails. Episode 2, there's a flamethrower. Episode 3, there's this black woman who's kind of this ninja with nunchucks, and it's just so weird.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about, I know we really only prepped the audience for Phantasm 1, but 2, it's such a direct sequel to it, but it reminds me a little bit of like the difference between Alien and Aliens. In the first Alien, it's like there's just Sigourney Weaver basically against this creature, and even the way she exterminates that creature is kind of similar. Like she's blasted out of an airlock, and their answer to getting rid of the tall man is to throw him down a hole, kind of like
1,000 feet straight down.
Yeah, and then throw a boulder on top of him, which is super absurd. And then in the second movie, they get armed up, and then there's a pair of them, and there's like a flamethrower, because there's like flamethrowers in Aliens. Yeah, it's almost like that, like extra militarization as the answer for facing horror. Like, what do you need to fight horror? More firepower, and that seems to have been the game of sequels to horror films, especially the ones that like came out in the 70s, a few years past, then the next one came out in the 80s.
Right. Can I bitch about another thing?
Yeah.
Something that is very key, I think, to Mike's character is that like he's like clever and inquisitive, and there's that whole scene where he like busts out of his bedroom by basically making a zip gun with a hammer and attack.
Yeah.
So kid couldn't take the door off the hinges. It opened inward. I know, I'll blow up the door. Okay. He could have just removed that door in 10 seconds.
So my theory here is that Mike is on the spectrum. Like there's something, he has like some mild form of autism.
Oh my God.
Because think about it, he's mechanically inclined, he's always working on his brother's car, he comes up with all these really interesting, like the whole thing of putting his lighter on the edge of the casket to close it. I would have never thought of that. And then, yes, why not just kick the door down or take it off of its hinges? You have a hammer, like you could totally take it right off the hinge. But instead, he makes, like you said, like a hammer zip gun, which is what? Crazy.
Speaking about him being on the spectrum explains some of his behavior, because when Jody ships Mike off with his girlfriend, it turns out that was his girlfriend. It got cut from the scenes, but his girlfriend and his girlfriend's friend.
Yeah, and they go into the antique store.
Right. The only way Mike addresses those women is barking orders at them. First of all, fuck you, Mike. But also, if he was on the spectrum, just his like, take me home now, pull over, stop, get going. He just like yells these orders at them. It would kind of describe someone who dealt with his own frustrations and fears in a very non-productive, truncated
there's
way.
Something about his delivery, and this is another thing that made me think of is, have you ever heard Temple Grandin speak?
I don't know.
She's an animal scientist, and she's really famous for designing slaughterhouses and stuff like that. A really very incredible woman, and she's pretty severely high functioning autistic, but she has that kind of yelling speak, or that like real declarative speak, which we know is just a result of like reset the camera, line, reset the camera, line, and so you don't, it's like playing like two riffs and then trying to put a song together with like all these patched up riffs.
Yeah.
But it definitely has that feel to it. Or, there's definitely some sort of like neuroatypical nature to this character.
Yeah.
But then, it could just be the movie, right? Like, because the Jawa like steals his shoe and he's running away and he has his shoe back. So there's there's clear continuity problems throughout this whole movie.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that are just...
There are a lot.
Yeah, and they're all just easily explained away by it being a dream. No problem.
Right.
Which I think is like the ultimate retcon, is just a dream. Mm-hmm. That's how the fucking Roseanne show ends. It's like this whole weird, it was just a dream. Yeah. Which always... It just seems like a cop-out to me, because you're already dealing with a fantastic element. Like, I'm already on board. Like, I've already shown up for an alien that lives in a mortuary that wants to turn a town into zombie slaves. Like, you don't have to play with my feelings on it any further.
Yeah.
Or maybe you do. I don't know. Like, if the dream element was left out, do you think this film would have had the staying power? Like, because there's something about dreams that people really respond to.
Sure. I don't know. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another, I guess, tough one for this movie is how women are portrayed in the movie. It's not even like your typical, like, boogeyman of patriarchy, sort of like women mistreated, object of whatever. Like, the only real sexuality in the film, it's clearly just supposed to be a trap, right?
Yeah.
So it's really just using sex against the characters. And then the film can't even be bothered to show you the rescue of the girls.
Yeah.
Just Reggie runs in and goes, yeah, I saved the girls. They're outside.
And a bunch of other ones, too.
Yeah, I found these other ones. And so, like, the film is, like, not even interested in having a hero to the women,
Totally.
And, there's the Volkswagen Bug scene, those girls. But
they're just like, Mike, what's going on here?
Right.
Long pause. He's just like freaking out, and they're like, oh my God. Like, they're just idiots.
But not even like...
Not even self-preservation exists in these characters.
But not even like typical horror movie bimbos either.
Right.
They're just not... they may as well be furniture in this film.
Yep.
And then he goes in to pick up the one girl from Dune's Cantina, which is another reference to Dune, apparently. I thought it was kind of a stretch, but the director mentioned that it was a direct reference.
All right.
Which to me, like, really reaffirms my theory, and it's not solely my theory, but the whole, like, Bene Gesserit thing from Dune, which, with those two Dune references, I started thinking about the planet of Arrakis, and I was like, wouldn't it be interesting if this was like a time portal to, like, the planet of Arrakis, and this movie, like, linked up to Dune somehow, and these characters were being just sent off to go, like, work for, like, House Atreides or something on some off-world planet.
I have no idea what you're talking about, but that sounds great.
And, well, anybody who's spent too much time reading the Dune novels will know exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, backing up to gender, I do think it's really interesting that the lady in lavender is the tall man.
Yeah,
I think that was a really interesting choice. It reminds me of a little. Have you ever seen The Hidden? It was a horror thriller sci-fi movie with Kyle MacLachlan. It's pretty fun, pretty great, super campy and ridiculous. But it's another one where an alien inhabits these different people's bodies, and they're all men until later it's a woman. He takes women's bodies, and it is this interesting thing of, like, no gender here. I mean, later in the Phantasm series, it does turn out that the tall man was this man a long time ago, and he was a scientist, and he created these possibilities through mystical sciences or something like that. So there is a gender to the tall man,
and there's a
in
character,
origin, but he's kind of trans. He can kind of, by shape-shifting, he can embody anything. And
so also, perhaps he's from the planet Transylvania.
Yes.
Because he can switch back and forth.
God damn it. Yeah.
I mean, because his house pieces out in the same way.
Yeah.
So
Dune, Rocky Horror. This is sort of doing the St. Elsewhere snow globe thing. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Do you know? No. Okay, so I'm going to... listeners, just hang in there with me, and I apologize if you've already heard this. So the very final episode of St. Elsewhere is this neuroatypical kid. it sort of zooms out of this snow globe of Saint Elsewhere, and the kid is looking at it. Basically, long story short, the last episode reveals that basically the entire series of Saint Elsewhere was possibly just in this kid's mind. Mm-hmm. Like, he just imagined this entire hospital drama. But the thing is, Saint Elsewhere had crossovers with other TV shows. Mm-hmm. And those TV shows had crossovers with other TV shows, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you do a family tree, it's like the majority of television series are in this kid's head. If St. Elsewhere existed in this kid's head from just staring at the snow globe for too long, then most TV shows actually exist in this kid's head. But the trouble comes when on St. Elsewhere and in other shows where actually real people playing themselves were on. So, like, are we all in this kid's head? Anyway, so do Dune and Rocky Horror Picture Show actually exist in the same universe, and they're bridged by Phantasm? Well, by what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, like, I love that snow globe idea, because in some ways, I mean, you're just talking about like the artist, right? Like an artist, like all these worlds exist in somebody's head. Like, I mean, how many universes exist in Stephen King's head? You know, even to the point where he has his meta novel, the Dark Tower series, which he appears in, and even at one point gives, there's a chapter near the end of the series where he basically talks about writing a massive book. Kind of talks about like the act of writing, and then, you know, he's a character in his own book, but also not. And then his characters in that book are sort of characters in other books. And then, you know, you think about authors whose works have escaped into forming their own genres, like H.P. Lovecraft, right? Like the entire Lovecraftian mythos started from one person, and talk about like a tree of connection, you know, like a family tree of stories. I mean, that shit is like super deep.
Yeah.
You know, and something we had talked about off mic a while ago was the idea that like so much horror is inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. And I always had this idea of like, if horror had been inspired by William S. Burroughs' Interzone. And I feel like Phantasm can very well fit into the idea of Burroughs' Interzone is an inspiration.
Okay. I can totally see that.
Yeah, especially because like the bureaucracy that's sort of implied by the plot of Phantasm. Like, okay, you've died, now you're being reanimated, and you're going to have to go off into work and death. You know, which I think is like probably a lot of people's fears. You know, people who just fucking can't take it anymore and then kill themselves. Imagine if like you can't take it anymore, like you hate your goddamn bar job, and you kill yourself, and all of a sudden you're like a midget barback on some other planet, you know, for eternity. And then your brain is like placed inside one of these spherical balls to just run around and just jack people for the rest of your life. I mean, I think that's an anxiety. This idea that it just never ends. It just kind of reminds me of that Sam Kinison joke about the Undertaker, about how the dead body is like, the Undertaker's like fucking the dead body, and the dead body's like, oh, it never ends. It never ends. And you wonder like if this whole idea of bureaucracy is hell, which you see over and over again, even in the Beetlejuice film, like the entire afterlife is depicted as a bureaucracy. It just makes me think of the tall man as just an agent of bureaucracy. You could see him just in Interzone outside of Tangiers doing some weird shit, smoking some sort of weird opium. So
that's great.
I don't know. I could be totally wrong about that.
What else we got?
Oh, one of the most interesting scenes, even though it was not very well done, is I love that the fingers get cut off of the tall man, and then it becomes kind of it's like a worm basically. Yeah. And then I thought like, oh, it turns into a fly. Like, oh, this is just more elements of death. Like his finger has become a maggot. So it's like, oh, is the tall man made out of elements of death? Is he just like one giant maggot creature? Which would be kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. Who knows? I mean, that whole sequence is just the worst. I think that little fly creature is just so shitty looking.
It looks terrible.
It looks terrible. And then the whole acting around them just like having it in a jacket. I mean, They don't even have like in commentary I watch, they don't even have the puppet in the jacket. They're just holding a jacket and smashing it around.
Yeah. It probably seemed like a good idea at the time.
Maybe. I guess.
You know, you just put an undersized tuxedo on a tall guy and give him some lifts and, like, you got a great villain. So, like,
Yeah. The proportion reminds me a little bit, you know, maybe this is actually Jodorowskian, but in Jodorowsky's book, Psychomagic, he talks about basically his metaphysical philosophy for creativity and how, I mean, Jodorowsky is either a con man or believes he's a magician in the sense that Alan Moore does. Like, that there's something to creativity that is sort of like magic with a K, and he is like summoning these weird things. But one of the things Jodorowsky talks about is proportion. So making things really small or making things really big is inherently uncanny. And though you have both of those things happening in this film, which I think is kind of an interesting idea. And I wonder where the director would have been influenced to get that from.
Yeah. Although not influenced, but followed something that this film definitely made me think of in terms of this open-ended and then I woke up dream narrative, dream logic that this film follows, is that it definitely became the terrain of Christopher Nolan and his films, is this sort of like elliptical, because one thing I will say about Phantasm is it is not quite and then I woke up.
Right.
Because at the end it's like, and then I woke up, and then he gets attacked anyway, and it's like there's no answer there. And even if you watch the further films, there is constantly no answer to what the fuck is happening, really. And I really appreciate that. And that is something that Christopher Nolan is masterful at, of creating these interweaving layers of reality that kind of leave you guessing, but don't lose you. You know, this isn't the runaway hit show Lost that fucking never knew what it was doing and just piled shit on top of shit. You know, Nolan is really good at having this very elaborate matrix that if it frays at the edges, you really have to do your homework to find those edges because it's really complicated.
Yeah, the Nolan thing, this is something I thought about Nolan's films, is that I think they're a little more linear than people think, in the way that they're sort of, especially Inception, there's levels. So it has a very like video game development. Like there's some kind of like a ludology to his films. Like there are
ludology,
like games. So like in video games, there's like ludology and narrativity. And so the narrative is the story of the thing. The ludology is like how the game mechanics work, like how far the character can jump over something, or what the actual puzzle is that you're solving. And this film, I wonder if it had come out post video games or post first person video games, if it would have a tighter rule set that it operated under.
I could see that.
Yeah.
Coincidentally, but disconnected from that, episode 5 actually has an entire sequence that is straight up like below video game resolution. They go out into this apocalypse world, but it looks like no better than a Sega Genesis game. It's really bizarre.
Weird.
Yeah.
Weird. You know, one of the things that always fascinates me about horror film directors is they're all pretty immersed in genre. So presumably they would be able to have the exact same conversation we're having, right? So they should know all these weird things are odd or not going to work, but they carry forward with them anyway. And I wonder if they feel those things when they're putting these movies together, or if they're just not aware. They're just too in it, and they're like, well, it was impossible to get that shot because dude fell off the ladder. And
right. That is something that really confuses me about the Phantasm movies, is if you watch interviews with Don Coscarelli, he's pretty smart, and he gets what he's doing. Like he definitely has a very meta mind about his own project.
And 2 very meta films. He has John Dies in the End, he did, which is super meta, and then Bubba Hotep, which is also in its own way an incredibly meta, like genre meta film.
Yes, but
it's also, you get the feeling that he's a little sloppy in his filmmaking, like, because that's why he realizes that Angus Scrimm was a great villain, is because he kept fucking up the scheduling shoot for some movie that he was on previously. So they get to the end of the day and be like, yeah, you're in makeup and costume, but we don't need you today. Sorry, bro. And then Angus Scrimm would give him this look that he was like, oh, wow, that's either a great villain or a pirate. and they didn't have enough money for a pirate movie, so he made the tall man character for him. So it's I love the idea of him just in a Charlie Chaplin way, just sort of like stumbling his way through this creative process where just these brilliant things are just flashing up because he's screwed up a little bit.
To be fair, I feel like you just described my entire life. So or all artists' lives. Can we save me from that one?
I guess so. I mean, I guess I have an art career of sorts. I get to paid to write words down, and then a paycheck shows up in my account because of that.
And how often are you lucky? How often are you just lucky?
I mean, I don't think I could have planned my particular career route. I mean, I was just bartending and thought I was going to go to law school, and now I'm like a copywriter. And then from copywriting kind of came, what I hope will be a more successful writing career, which is just, that's about as typical as it gets for copywriters. Like every single copywriter ever has some shitty novel in their drawer or desktop folder now. Mine says, "Please God, let me not have to go to work." That's what my folder with all my writing in it says. We didn't really talk too much about the soundtrack, and which is something we always seem to do, you being a musician and me having listened to music in the past.
Which makes you very qualified.
I'm very qualified.
I've heard music.
Yeah. What did you think about the soundtrack? It's definitely, there's synth elements of it, but there's also a lot of funeral organ, which I think is pretty cool for this movie since so much of it takes place in a mausoleum.
Yeah. I think the theme song is about as good as any... No, let me rephrase that. I think Phantasm's theme music is one of the best. It's right there with Halloween. It's chilling. Mm-hmm. It's atmospheric. If you just played it for someone who had no association to it, that person would start to get a feel for what the movie would be about. Yeah. It's kind of brilliant.
There's a metal band called Entombed.
Yeah.
That on their album Left Hand Path, they do a cover of it.
Oh.
And it's awesome. They really nail it. It's definitely, they metal it up a little bit, but the notes, the real sparse notes are there. And it's kind of interesting. The essentials of a horror movie really are interesting looking villain, soundtrack. If you have those two things wrapped up, the middle can really be a hot mess.
Right.
Really think about Halloween is really no better in a lot of ways, like the original Halloween. I guess Jamie Lee Curtis is probably a better actress than exists. But the best actor in the entire Phantasm franchise is clearly Angus Scrimm, and he's kind of you could imagine him just really holding it down in a dinner theater production of King Lear.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
But to his credit, a sign of a really good actor is the fact that he has no lines in this movie. No. And actually I saw him at I saw a video of him at some convention where he's like, ha, 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 here are my lines from Phantasm. And he has 7 lines, and and 2 of them are boy.
Yeah.
Which having him do in a row is hilarious. But he does them so well. It's similar to what I was saying in the Return of the Living Dead episode about Linnea Quigley. She has a couple of lines, and some of them are just throwaways, but she nails them so hard that they're really iconic.
Yeah. I like the idea that he's a craft actor, he's really into the actor's craft. There's a little video you can find on YouTube that's basically the intro to the Laserdisc version of Phantasm, and he talks about how the director tells him he's going to be an alien, and you get the feeling that he thought he meant like an illegal alien, because he talks about, will I be doing a Chinese accent? Will I be doing a man from Europe? And you're like, oh wow, he's not deterred at all from the idea that any of these nationalities he might be called upon to portray, and he's just going to do it because that's what an actor would do. Something very Royal Shakespeare Company about him. And I also love the idea that he's actually a Grammy-winning actor. First, he wrote liner notes and won a Grammy for it. So you're like, man, what an interesting dude.
Absolutely. Completely changing the subject.
Sure.
I do think it's interesting that this is in part a zombie film because there's reanimation happening.
Yep.
And it does bring up the zombie conundrum that is explored in The Returned or handling the undead, which is what do you do when you are confronted with the reanimated body of a loved one.
Yep.
It doesn't spend time ruminating on that by any means, but it's totally there. It's actually clunky with it when they find that it's Tommy.
Yeah.
It maybe doesn't have the weight that it could, that like the one who they were just at his funeral is now reanimated.
Yeah. But it really does play into that fear a bit in the film, because there's the whole question of, are their parents,
where are my parents?
Now zombies? Yeah. And there's a very interesting moment, which I think is kind of like really, actually pretty good character exposition, which is the older brother opens up the coffin and can't even open his eyes. He doesn't want to know whether or not the bodies are still in the coffin, or he doesn't want to see them in that state of decomposition. And so he just slams it down without looking at them. And then Mike opens up the coffin and looks in and is horrified. But what's interesting is you don't know, is he horrified because he's just looked at his mom's 2-year-old rotting body, or because the body's not there, which I think is pretty interesting. But you would think that, especially with the sequel, where you have just graveyards just completely emptied, which I think is a really neat image in the sequel, is like that early scene where they just roll into this town and it's just ravaged and there's just holes in the ground everywhere. Like these bodies have been taken, like, and at that point the tall man doesn't even give a shit anymore. He's not trying to like pretend. He's just going for numbers at that point.
Yeah. I think in some, for me, and this is getting on to the franchise again, but I guess there's a little bit of me, having watched all of them, that's a little bit mad at the potential wasted. You know, on one hand, there's no potential wasted. It's like,
right,
Coscarelli and his gang, they made 4 films, kind of 5, depending on how you want to think about it. They created this amazing legacy, and they did it on their terms for the most part. It might have been very tough for them. I mean, it took them forever to finance each movie.
Yeah.
There were all these struggles. I sort of feel, as a viewer, not a fanboy, but as a viewer, that I think the premise was so strong that there was so much opportunity to take it up another level. And I know sequels are hard, and you know, the Scream franchise is all about that in the most brilliant way. But unfortunately, so much of what the Scream movies make fun of, the Phantasm franchise is exactly what they're mocking. All of the rules that keep accumulating on each Scream movie, those are talking about Phantasm. Lots of films, but Phantasm too. I just feel like, God, the tall man, this other planet, all these ideas, all this potential, it never manifests. It actually just got muddy and chaotic, and then got really shitty. And I kind of wish the tall man got awesome.
Well, I mean, it's so interesting to think about. Like, it's been like close to 40 years since that movie came out. I mean, you got to think he probably started working on it at least a year or two before, right? You know, even though it doesn't feel like it sometimes. So we're talking like 40 years of thinking about these characters. I mean, just look at like sci-fi, how sci-fi developed. I mean, imagine a world where Phantasm kicked off as big as Star Wars did. And then like all science, you know, basically all science fiction post-Star Wars sort of references Star Wars in some way. You just have to, whether it be an engine noise or whatever. You know, imagine that whole unknowable, semi-psychedelic, dark sci-fi had become the mainstream. I mean, I don't even know what sort of world that would look like, but that whole dark sci-fi or horror sci-fi thing, it is big, but it's not the main focus anymore. But like, given 40 years, like, imagine you had to redo your first album every 8 years, whenever you could get money together to do it. What would it look like 40 years from now?
No, totally. It's a really impossible question.
I mean, or you just look at punk bands, though, right? Like, you're like, okay, there's your first punk album, and then like you're still making shitty punk albums. I mean, I don't.
And it's very hard for it not to taint. As a listener, it's hard for that not to taint the first record.
Right.
You know, some bands, they just get less interesting, and that's fine. But when there's a distinct, fuck, you really had something.
The Phantasm films are very resistant to what happened outside. They're not like as on trend as you would expect them to be for maybe some of these franchises. Like, for instance, the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Whatever happened to be kind of going on in pop culture at the time was very riffed on by those films, but that doesn't seem to have happened with Phantasm.
That didn't seem to happen with Phantasm. No, that's very true, and I think to its fault, and not that it needs to be trendy But we kind of get inured to certain techniques and certain ways of thinking about things. And when you have that much time to work on an idea and it doesn't evolve, I'm kind of in favor of things evolving and adapting.
I mean, just think about this. Like, okay, what happened with the funeral industry is you went away from independent funeral homes, like the Tall Man's Morningside Funeral Home, to this more corporate structure where, you know, all the embalming for the entire state or whatever is done in one facility. So it actually looks way more like what it looks at like on the back end of the first Phantasm movie, where it's just all the same and it's like all white. And the funeral homes now are just facades, basically. They're like sets where you drop the body off and pick the body up and have the ceremony at. So, you know, what does that corporatization of death look like in a Phantasm film? Not explored at all, but could have been pretty interesting.
Right.
Instead, it just kind of, you're really just building on how horrific the Tall Man is, because it's basically really all that survived through the sequels is like how creepy looking Angus Scrimm is, which is it's pretty good. You know, it's like having a great frontman for a band. You know, like David Lee Roth's always going to be David Lee Roth, no matter what's going on behind him.
Yeah, it's true.
This might be something to end on. Is I remember somebody, when I told them we were doing this episode, was like, "Oh, I can't wait to hear you guys tear it apart." And I thought about that, and at first, when I was first watching it again and some of like the stiff lines were happening, I was like, man, I am going to rip this thing to pieces.
Yeah.
But as I watched all the way through, other than the complaint of, oh, the acting's maybe not so good, the editing's not so good, basically between budget and just general sloppiness, that explains all that stuff away. And once you've said that, I don't know that there's anything else to like really hate about like the original Phantasm.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like we did kind of shit on it a lot. However, I actually love this movie. I think it's more that if there were no sequels, if it was just this one-off, one and done, I think I would have loved it a lot more, because I wouldn't have had a chance to see what those limitations were based on, and realizing like the problems with it were not just budget and time. They were actually creative limitations.
Right.
And so it sort of infects the original. But on its own, I think this is a great movie. There's so many interesting ideas. Casca really has a lot of great ideas. And a lot of them are manifest really well. Yeah,
I mean, it's there's something about when an idea comes to you from a dream. You hear a lot of horror writers talk about that, and this film's genesis was he had a dream of being chased around a mausoleum by a silver orb, which is, you know, it shows up in the film as imagined.
Could have come from a Magritte painting or something like that.
Yeah, it's that sort of thing. And you think about like other movies or other horror ideas that came from dreams or nightmares. I mean, you have Frankenstein right there. Like Mary Shelley had a dream, woke up the next day. If the stories are to be believed, she cranked it out in like 2 days or something like that. I mean, not 2 days, but it was really fast.
It was fast.
And the whole idea of dream definitely seems to be linked up to horror. Because, I mean, what do you have? Like, there's an entire category of dreams called nightmares. Like, nobody talks about, like, rom-com dreams. Like, people don't really have that sort of thing. Like, there's nightmares. And I think that's really one of the things that's so special about horror is it just does tap into that sort of ability of the human to generate their own fears in their own mind in these odd, psychedelic, disjointed, disconnected ways. And I think that might be part of what allows so many people to just love this film is it functions like their dreams. Like, yeah, it jumps around. It's weird. It doesn't make sense. Like, there's some strange titties and then a knife. Like, you know, and that's really how a dream sort of works.
Totally.
Definitely getting a leopard print pillow, though, after, just like Mike's.
I used to have those exact leopard print pillows.
Pretty killer.
They're so good. They fell apart eventually.
Yeah, watching this movie, one of the things I love about horror movies, and maybe we could just end on this part, is like punk rock music, like when you see a film like Phantasm, you really think that like a certain type of person thinks, I could do that. You know, and I think one of the things I like about this movie, Phantasm, is it makes me want to go home and write a story. Because it just seems like, okay, this wild shit would never fly in an MFA class. and it doesn't need to, and it's classic and it's awesome, and it's just like the type of expression that horror gives you permission for, I think is really interesting. And I'm so glad that this stuff exists in the world, because it lets people fly this really particular freak flag that is really just what the whole show is about, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's end there.
Yeah.
Fade to black, roll the credits. Everybody, watch Pontypool, which you should, even if you don't listen to our episode on Pontypool, you should see that movie. It's super good.
Yeah, it's surprisingly original. People were kind of talking about it, and I had watched a lot of newer horror movies, and I saw why people liked them or raved about them or whatever. But that one has such a unique flow to it.
Yeah.
That it's a very unexpected movie with some really great character acting.
Totally. And don't forget, please, if you haven't already, give us some stars and, not some, all 5
of them.
Stars.
5 stars.
On iTunes, a review if you're so inclined, even just a couple of kind words.
Yeah.
Very much appreciated.
We're apparently in the top 5% of podcasts now because of our number of downloads, which I don't know what that means. Who knows? One day we'll be able to retire.
Still working a job.
Yeah. So thank you guys. Please rate, review. Please show up next time to listen to Pontypool and then Green Room, which I'm super excited about.
Absolutely, me too.
All right.
Till then.
Party on.
Not Tommy, the brother. Cody? Fuck.
Jody.
Because when Cody ships him off with
Jody.
So when Jody...